Mike, you know more about Russia than just about anyone. So set the scene for us. It is day 6 of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What is happening now?
Right now, we're witnessing a change in tactics by Vladimir Putin and his army that has invaded Ukraine. The original strategy was a kind of shock and awe to try to bomb a few cities, threaten a few places, and they hoped that the Ukrainian army would run, Zelensky would go to Lviv, and this could be all over. That didn't work. That didn't happen. The Russian army has sustained amazing number of casualties. By the Ukrainian accounts, 6,000 soldiers have already died. So now he shifted to an old tactic. It's a tragic, horrific tactic. We've seen it in Chechnya. We've seen it in Syria, where they are going to bomb and occupy and encircle Russian major cities. And that's what's happening right now. Kharkiv is under siege. Kiev is under siege. And tragically, I think it will be a major escalation in the number of people that will die, first and foremost, Ukrainian civilians. The Russian military is more modernized. Putin's been modernizing his army for 15 or 20 years. I think people need to understand that. He's put tremendous resources into increasing their capabilities. And the Ukrainian military doesn't have certain resources. First and foremost, they lack air power. They lack the ability to bomb and attack Russian forces on the ground. Right now, as we're talking, there's a convoy 40 miles long on a road going into Kiev. If they had air capability, they would be bombing that convoy. It would be, these are easy targets if you have sophisticated aircraft. The Ukrainians don't. And that asymmetry is being felt in terms of how easy it is for the Russian army literally to just roll down the street from the north. And tragically, the capability side, there's a huge asymmetry. But Katie, there's a huge asymmetry on the will side the other way around. I think it's really important to understand that in the long run, I don't see how Putin wins this long war. I just listened last night to 36 Russian soldiers that have been captured, videos of them. I speak Russian, I can understand what they're talking about. And, you know, to a person, these young men, they have no idea why they're fighting. They have no idea why they're in Ukraine. The hour-long rambling speech that Putin gave on the eve of this war to justify it, they obviously didn't follow it. I listened to the whole thing and I could barely follow it in terms of its logic. So over time, that asymmetry of will play a huge role. Doesn't mean they're going to win the fight initially, but Putin doesn't have an end game. Like once he takes Kiev, then what? You know, he's going to put a puppet government in, then what? They will be under siege either physically or with passive civic resistance for the rest of the time they're in Ukraine.
You have spent time with Putin. You know him. You say he has become increasingly unhinged. What is going on with Vladimir Putin, Mike?
Well, first, let me say two things. I have known Putin. I met him in 1991. I've written about him for 20 years and for 5 years in the Obama administration, first working at the White House and then in Moscow. I was in every major meeting he had with the president, Vice President Biden at the time, secretaries of state, National Security Council leaders. And I would say a couple of things. One, we have been too slow to realize and understand his evilness. You know, Katie, I write a column for the Washington Post, and a couple of years ago, I wrote, Vladimir Putin is evil in response to what he did to try to kill the opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. And I was flooded with hate mail from Americans saying, how dare you call this leader evil? How dare you say this? My first anti-Putin article was 20 years ago, talking about how he's going to crack down on democracy. So I think the first thing we need to do is understand who he is. He doesn't care about lives. He's made that clear. This is his 5th war, not his 1st war. And that when he says crazy things, things that think, well, he could never do that, we need to listen to him carefully. You know, just a month ago, I was debating among other national security experts in the government and outside, and many were saying he could never march all the way to Kiev. He would never do that. There would be too many lives lost. We see where we're at today. So when he threatens to use nuclear weapons, we should listen to that carefully and respond. And I don't want to sound alarmist. I think it's a very low probability event. I think he does understand what mutual assured destruction means. That is, nobody can win a nuclear war. But you don't say things like that if you're a rational actor, if you feel like you're in control of things. You say things like that when you're feeling desperate. And as I listen to Putin, I listen to every single speech and word that he says, he sounds increasingly desperate, increasingly unhinged.
Let's play out that nuclear threat. That scared the bejesus out of me when I heard that nuclear weapons were being put on high alert. Tell us what that means potentially with, of course, you don't want to be alarmist, but as you say, you have to listen when he speaks. So play that out for us, Mike.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, this is unprecedented. I cannot recall a Soviet, Russian, or American leader who ever said such things so starkly, threatening to use nuclear weapons. Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Mr. Khrushchev did not speak in these terms. He has broken a taboo. For decades, we have all said together, there can never be the use of nuclear weapons. And just in January, literally the 5 nuclear powers, recognized nuclear powers, just signed a new resolution saying we'll never use nuclear weapons. So this is different. It is. Some people are saying, "Oh, he does this all the time." No, that is not accurate. This is something qualitatively different. Now, I'm not an intelligence officer. I used to, read a lot of secret intelligence when I worked in the government. The job of the international of our intelligence community, the job of my former colleague, the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, probably one of our best experts in the country, in the government right now on Russia. By the way, that is a great choice. I don't know if it was accidental, but it turns out that was a brilliant choice by President Biden to put Bill in charge of the CIA. Bill's job and his team and the rest of the intelligence community is to figure out the percentages, the probabilities. And if I were guessing, it's still very low. I think Putin knows our capabilities. I helped to negotiate the New START treaty with him. He knows exactly what we have. But let's say the probability is, 0.5%. The job of the policymakers then is to move that number down, is to make that number 0.3, 0.2, 0.1%. And I think right now it is incumbent upon President Biden and his team and other nuclear powers to do that. And I hope they would be doing a couple of things. Number one, our military leaders should be talking to each other. So General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he should be interacting with his counterpart. His name is General Gerasimov. In the past, they have used this channel to communicate. I hope they're doing that today. But second, a nuclear war doesn't just affect the United States and Russia, it affects the entire world, of course. And I think the most important leader in the world today that still has some authority with Vladimir Putin is the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. And I would hope that we would be, despite our differences and our competition and all that, that we would be in touch with Xi Jinping directly to plead with him, to plead with Vladimir Putin to clarify that he is not in the state of mind where he would contemplate using nuclear weapons.
Do you think we are doing that?
I don't know. If whenever I get the chance to communicate with my friends and colleagues in the administration, these are the arguments I make, but I don't know if that's happening.
You mentioned Putin being increasingly unhinged. Reports about Zelensky's heroism is making him crazy, I know you believe. Why do you say that?
Mr. Zelensky is from the eastern part of Ukraine. His first language is Russian, not Ukrainian. And by the way, he's Jewish. He is not a Nazi. He has lost family members in the Holocaust. His grandparents fought in what they call the Great Patriotic War. So when he pivoted away from Putin and decided he could not negotiate with him, that's when I think Putin decided to try to remove him. And you're absolutely right. He's never considered him a formidable leader. I actually had the honor to host President Zelensky at Stanford last August. I spent many hours with him. And he went into this, that Putin doesn't think that he's a real elected leader. He's just a comedian on television. And it most certainly is driving him nuts that Zelensky is demonstrating just unbelievable, heroic performance right now. The way he is standing firm, just in touch with one of his colleagues just a few hours ago, and contemplating whether it would be better to survive in Lviv than die in Kiev. And he said, Mike, he's not going anywhere. So there's no reason to talk about that. That, of course, that is open defiance of Putin, is driving him nuts, and compounded with how poorly the Russian military has performed so far. Putin's watching the same videos we are. He's seeing the same soldiers, giving these crying testimonials on their phones with their mothers. The Ukrainians who hold them, by the way, they put a phone in front of their face and they say, call your mama right now. And they do. And it's a pretty humiliating experience. You can believe that Putin is seeing those too.
When I heard those reports, Mike, I wondered, is this going to piss Putin off even more? His ego is not going to be able to sustain this, and he is going to escalate the military strategy. But then I think of the alternative, and I don't know if it would have been better, but it did worry me because I think he does not want to be humiliated on a world stage.
Right. Well, it's a complicated, two-step, because I also believe, and this is not popular to say, but I think the Biden administration and other leaders, I think we need to even bring in maybe some intermediaries, by the way, people that Putin actually listens to help with this. He doesn't really listen to President Biden. They don't have a rapport. Even people like, the former Italian Prime Minister, Berlusconi. Berlusconi has a close personal relationship with Putin. I would call on him. Even Henry Kissinger. Henry, though I just saw him a few months ago. He's, I think he's 99 years old, but he is, his mind is active, and he's one of the few people in the West that Mr. Putin respects. He used to see him all the time when I was ambassador. And there may be others, but I do think privately we should be looking for making arguments for de-escalation and for off-ramps and for ending the war. Of course, that has to be part of the solution. I do not believe that this is somehow dishonorable to try to do that. The trade-off is, thousands and maybe tens of thousands of innocent Ukrainian people losing their lives. I think you have to lean in where you can.
Well, I guess a lot of people watching this want to know, why hasn't more been done to support the people of Ukraine? And that's a complicated question. But why haven't the NATO countries done more? Why hasn't the US done more? And now that they are, is it too little too late? And I'm just curious if you can reflect on the reaction to this invasion, which has been many months in the works.
Yeah. Well, it depends on where we pick up the story. So I won't go way back, but I think it's important for everybody to understand that after 30 years of a very close relationship with Ukraine, bipartisan support, Democrats and Republicans, that was interrupted in the Trump era. Remember, he was impeached because he withheld military assistance. I want to repeat that. He withheld military assistance to Mr. Zelensky so that because he wanted alleged dirt as a quid pro quo from the Ukrainian government. And as a result of that, our relationship with Mr. Zelensky and the Ukrainian government was damaged. It was in the worst place it had ever been at the beginning of the Biden administration. Now, the Biden administration changed that and had a different approach, But in my view, it was too slow. I was calling for more military assistance a long, long time ago. And when Mr. Zelensky came and visited President Biden, he saw Biden the day before he came out to see us at Stanford. He was asking for that too. And in retrospect, I think we should have given him more, particularly on air defenses, right? The Patriot missile system, the anti-missile system. That is something takes a long time to deploy. You have to learn how to use it. It's not something you can just ship in overnight. They don't have any Patriots in Ukraine today.
That basically intercepts incoming missiles into the country.
And aircraft, yes. It is a very effective weapon, but it's a very sophisticated weapon. So we were slow on that part. We were better today, and I applaud, I sincerely applaud what the Biden administration has done over the last several weeks, increasing military assistance, putting in place sanctions, and supporting and bolstering our NATO allies with American soldiers on the borders. I think those are the three principal pieces. But I'm in touch with Ukrainians every single minute. I was just in touch with a very senior one 5 minutes before joining you, Katie, and the overwhelming message is we need more. We need more Stingers to shoot down aircraft. We need more Javelins to shoot down tanks. When you look at those convoys of those Russian, 40 miles long, they need weapons to attack that convoy now, and they do not have sufficient weapons to do it. And the longer, to state the obvious, it's a lot harder to get Stingers to Kharkiv today than it would have been 2 months ago.
But I guess the question too, and it might sound uninformed, but why can't some of these NATO countries send actual personnel, aircraft, et cetera, into Ukraine?
It's not a naive question at all. It's exactly the question that every Ukrainian is asking right now. And in particular, they are asking for the West and NATO to implement a no-fly zone in Ukraine. And if they were unwilling to do it throughout the entire country, at least have a no-fly zone in Western Ukraine to protect, the Lviv and that area. I think the response, I know the response from the Biden administration is that's tantamount to a declaration of war against Russia. You can't enforce a no-fly zone if you're not willing to shoot down planes that violate it. And if an American plane shoots down a Russian plane, that means we are at war with Russia. And the President Biden does not want to go to war with Russia. And I actually support his decision on that. I do not think we are not capable of fighting. Well, we are capable of it, but the risk of fighting a war with Russia today in Ukraine, I think is beyond what we should do now. And so if we're not going to do that, if we're going to stand on the sidelines, we have to do everything else possible to help the Ukrainians prevail in this war.
Let me ask you in closing about sanctions, Mike. I read that some of the oligarchs are putting pressure on Putin because the sanctions are having an effect on their wealth. But tell me if the sanctions are effective, and along with that, what about internal dissent against Putin? Could that possibly have a negative impact on his ambitions?
So that's a complicated, hard question for a number of reasons. First, everybody needs to remember that Russia's a dictatorship. So those oligarchs can't go to the parliament and get their friendly parliamentarians to pass a resolution denouncing the war. It doesn't work that way. Second, not all oligarchs are alike. I think there's this misconception in the West of the oligarchs, and they're all these business people trying to put pressure on Putin. In fact, most of them are rich because Putin gave them their companies. He gave them their property rights, not the other way around. So they don't have any way to lobby him to say, lift these sanctions. Three, Putin is extremely isolated right now. Even when I was ambassador, that was 8 years ago, would write cables about how isolated he was, that he didn't listen to people. He didn't meet with oligarchs. He didn't meet with his own advisors. And he thought, after 22 years in power, you think you know everything. You're not listening to people. That adds another component. So how this action reaction cycle works, right? Sanctions punish the Russians, and then the Russians put pressure on Putin. That's hard to do if you don't even have an ability to interact with them. And at the same time, I would say a couple other things. I talk to Russians, friends and elites every single day. And that society is completely shocked that Putin launched this scale of military invasion. Yes, the babushkas watching TV, state channels and know nothing else and have no other information. Yes, they probably think that they're neo-Nazis and Ukraine, et cetera. But people in Moscow, elites, middle class people, educated people, nobody thinks that this is a good idea. And they are feeling the pressure of sanctions. They are shocked at how it is, it's affected the ruble, it's affected their bank accounts. They are in panic, Katie, right now. They understand that their comfortable lives from before have been shattered. And so, two things need to happen going forward. One, we need to keep putting that pressure on. There are many more things that the West could do to put more pressure on all Russians. And, Katie, I used to say targeted sanctions back in the first war because the Russian people needn't suffer. I disagree with that now. The passivity of Russian people have given Putin the ability to do this. So I think there's no more fence sitting. There's no more pretending there's innocence in Russia today. So I think there are more things we can do, things like Visa and MasterCard. I lived in Russia many years. I use my Visa card every day. Disrupting those transactions would have a giant impact on people inside Russia. And by the way, I've been in touch with lots of companies over the last several days, social media companies, for instance, in terms of changing their policies. And I understand they're trying to, it's a fine line between ethical things to do and not. But in times of war, there's never been a moment of clarity of good and evil than right now. So if you are doing business in Russia, if you are making money off of Russia today, I hope you're thinking, is that a moral, ethical position to take? Because I don't think history will judge those who think, well, I'm helping out, I'm just neutral here. No, there's no neutral space. So I want to see more from us. And then, I say two things about pressure inside Russia. Like I said, I'll bet you can count on one hand how many people actually support this war, but people fear Putin, and they should, because he's a killer. He is brutal. He's already arrested thousands of people just in the last several days. I understand that. But I also study these things. I'm teaching a class right now on political mobilization at Stanford. And one thing we know to be true in history, if there's 1,000 people, yes, they can arrest and beat you up. If there's hundreds of thousands of people, they can't arrest everybody. And I think that has to be the mentality of Russians. Stop this war, not just to save your Ukrainians, and not just to save, by the way, Russians. I think people in America need to understand there are lots of Russians that Putin is killing right now. Kharkiv, has a big population of Russians that live there. I've been to Kharkiv. It was easy for me to get around in Kharkiv. Everybody spoke Russian. He's killing Russians right now. So I hope that Russians understand that this is a moment of truth, and it's first and foremost to stop the war, but second, it's to save their own economy. It's to save their own future of their children and grandchildren, because otherwise this will be devastating for Russia as well.
Absent of that uprising internally, Mike, are we seeing a sort of a new version of the domino theory? Do you see Putin's ambitions reaching beyond Ukraine, some of the former Soviet republics that became independent after the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
Yes and no. And let me explain. Yes to dominoes in this respect, but in a different respect. Vladimir Putin has now gone to war 5 times since he's been the leader of Russia. Chechnya, 1999, Georgia, 2008, Ukraine, 2014, Syria, 2015, and now this war. Those previous 4 dominoes, to use your word, he won. And I think that emboldened him. And it reminds me a lot of Leonid Brezhnev, the last leader to be in power as long as Mr. Putin has been. And Brezhnev did the same thing in the 70s. Remember, right? Marxist-Leninist regimes were taking over all over the place. Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, then Angola, then Mozambique, Nicaragua. It seemed like history was on his side, and then he overreached. Then he invaded Afghanistan. And that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. And I think there's some historic parallels here. Putin has overreached in Ukraine. He underestimated the resistance. He overestimated his power. He had a misreading, just like Brezhnev did. Brezhnev thought it was going to be a cakewalk, and Afghanistan would become the 16th republic of the Soviet Union. It would be over in a matter of weeks. We know how wrong
That
he
it
was
became
there.
the graveyard of empires, right?
Exactly. And for us, we suffered a horrific failure in Afghanistan, but nothing compared to the Soviet failure there. And it later helped unravel the Soviet Union. It was part of what sparked Gorbachev's reforms, was that horrific war. I see parallels here of overreach, and that therefore I don't yet see Putin's pretensions to those countries you just described, in part because of a very controversial, but I think very just and brilliant policy decision that started under President Clinton and was extended with under President Bush, and that was NATO expansion. Think about where we would be right now if Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania weren't in NATO. Think about where we'd be if Poland wasn't in NATO, and that border where we see so many people getting out. They know when they get to the other side, they're safe. Without NATO, it would be a very different world. It would feel a lot more like the interwar period between World War I and World War II. And I think Putin understands that. I would be very, very surprised if he launched a conscious attack against any one of our NATO allies. Thankfully, leaders had the wisdom to make that move when they did.
Because if that happened, the full power of NATO would be unleashed. And actually, I guess that would be another world war.
Yes. It's Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Attack on one is attack on all. And we are obligated by that treaty to defend our allies. And there's no doubt in my mind that President Biden would. And I hope there's no doubt in President Putin's mind.